When talking about Benjamin Franklin, do you think of the founding father or the inventor of the lightning rod? But the truth is that he is a much more complex character. An apprentice to whatever caught his attention, he dedicated his life to innovation and public service more than anyone else in his time. His creative ability and his vast common sense were children of enlightenment, although shaped by a self-taught education that conceived scientific research as a way to improve people's lives. But the vicissitudes of his time also led him to be a prominent actor during the American Revolution of Independence, particularly from ideas and diplomacy. The only founding father who signed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Treaty of Paris, three foundational documents of the United States. His vast erudition is only matched by his advanced wit, becoming one of the most beloved Americans in his country and one of the first to achieve celebrity in 18th century Europe. This is the life of Benjamin Franklin. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to follow us on our Instagram account, like this video, and leave your comments. Benjamin was born in Boston, the capital of the English colony of Massachusetts, on January 17, 1706. He was the son of a candle and soap maker who married twice and fathered 17 children throughout his life. His maternal grandparents, who were Presbyterian Christians, had emigrated from Great Britain several decades earlier, fleeing the religious persecution waged by King Charles I against dissenting Protestants. This is not a minor fact, as Franklin will be instructed in the Presbyterian tradition at his mother's behest. But as for his formal education, it was abruptly interrupted at the age of 10, when the precarious situation of the family caused his father to withdraw him from school to involve him in candle making. Even so, Benjamin received some lessons from a private tutor in the following years. It is here that his curiosity will begin to awaken explosively, covering the most diverse areas. In his autobiography, he said that as a child he dreamed of being a sailor and sailing the ocean. All his life was therefore of known taste for swimming, and even then he had his first invention, creating diving fins. Of course, it was something rudimentary, with boards tied to his feet and hands, but it showed his great ingenuity. That ability led him to go to work at the age of 12 at one of his brother's printing press, and there he began to cultivate the trade that he would use all his life. His printing press experience marked his entry into publishing, where he achieved several early successes. His brother founded the fourth newspaper in the colonies, based in Boston. At age 15, the young Franklin wanted to contribute a column, but it was rejected. This motivated him to write under a pseudonym, with which he managed to publish at least 14 essays on various topics of marriage, religion, fashion, and rights, gaining great popularity among readers. At that time, he was already impressing with ideas that showed substance and maturity in his thinking. However, it also caused some disagreements with his brother. And finally, he chose to leave that printing press to move to New York in 1723, and immediately after to Philadelphia, being only 17 years old. At that time, Philadelphia was a city that was not even 50 years old, and it was seen as a symbol of the peace fostered by the Quaker communities. In the Pennsylvania colony, these were other communities of Protestant Christians. Although he arrived with no money, he quickly found work as a typesetter in a printing house and managed to stay there for 2 years. During that time, he met a young woman named Deborah Reed, whom he courted diligently until he proposed the idea of marriage, even though it ultimately did not happen. From Philadelphia, Franklin crossed the Atlantic Ocean for the first time and arrived in London, where he sought to perfect his craft as a writer. He stayed there for another 2 years, but decided to return to Philadelphia in 1727 to take advantage of the opportunities he had seen in the business. At age 21, he established himself as a printer and publisher in Pennsylvania, creating a printing press. He achieved a golden opportunity by receiving the order and authorization to issue the paper money of the British colonies, a product of good earnings in 1730. Benjamin buys the weekly newspaper the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was the second newspaper created in the colony, and thus makes it a reference in the press, for 18 years. He had also resumed his relationship with Deborah Reed, who in his absence had been led to marry another man, from whom she later separated without divorcing. That same year, Franklin's first child was also born, though fathered with a different woman about whom no details are known. It is only known that the child was raised by Benjamin and Deborah, who by 1730 now decided to get married. However, as her status remained that of a married woman, the couple could only celebrate a private ceremony to formalize their marital relationship, which was not officially registered. And 2 years later, they managed to conceive their first child together. This event coincides with the start of Franklin's greatest literary adventure, the creation of Poor Richard's Almanac in 1732. It was a kind of yearbook that contained miscellaneous information about astronomy, curiosities, hobbies, medical advice, the Christian calendar of saints, among other topics. This yearbook opened a period of prosperity for his printing press and became the second most known publication in the colonies, only behind the Bible. The young Franklin served as writer, editor, and director of the Almanac, although he attributed everything to the fictitious pseudonym of Richard Saunders. But that did not prevent him from giving important traces of his thought, his principles, and even his rejection of slavery. He read in heaps, and that's how he fed the most diverse interests he had about science, philosophy, politics, and religion. By the way, another of the striking uses he gave to his printing press this decade was the promotion of Freemasonry, becoming the first settler to publish a Masonic book. None other than the famous Anderson's Constitutions, a publication of no less importance for Anglo-Saxon Freemasonry from the 18th century onwards. His success as a printer and publisher earned him prestige in Philadelphia, enabling him to begin his journey as a public figure. In that decade, he helped create the Philadelphia Fire Department, the first in the colony. By 1736, he had also become the secretary of the General Assembly of the Colony of Pennsylvania. Although this also coincided with the fatal loss of his second child due to smallpox. While his secretary position was more administrative, this entry into the colonial legislature gave him room to influence the political, social, and economic life of the colony. And a year later, Franklin was also appointed as Postmaster General of Philadelphia, taking the opportunity to drive several reforms that would improve the service in the following years. Meanwhile, he juggled these two public duties. He also continued with his work at the printing press and with his quest to satisfy his endless curiosity. As early as 1731, he had helped to establish what later became the first public library in Philadelphia. And in 1740, he had played a key role in the creation of the University of Pennsylvania. He was demonstrating his proactive ability to drive the colony's advancement at that time. After all, Franklin had seen the benefits enjoyed by the population in Great Britain and only wanted to emulate what he considered useful for the American colonists. Amidst the bustling stage, Franklin was seen as a very peculiar but charismatic individual from Philadelphia. His sharp wit, determined character, and lively sense of humor fully corresponded with his simple appearance, which reflected a friendly man. His facial expression with big eyes was always prone to a smile. He was a person who had no trouble earning the respect and esteem of people. This perhaps explains his ease in changing lovers over the years, despite never having broken his relationship with Deborah. Also during that time, it became usual for him to hold gatherings in some places in the city, especially with his regular drinking companions. It was in the decade of 1740 that he delved more into the world of experimentation, having his first notable invention in 1742. It was a heating system that was later christened as the stove. Franklin, which quickly became popular for its greater efficiency in handling smoke and its lower consumption of coal or firewood. Franklin persisted in his interest in advancing knowledge, and in 1743, when his other daughter was born, he helped found the Philosophical Society, which would later become the American Philosophical Society. Simultaneously, he participated in the colonial legislature and carved out his trade in the postal service. By the late 1990s, he gained significant recognition for supporting health and education initiatives. But his insatiable spirit was increasingly leaning towards science, and this would lead him to take new directions. After accumulating a modest fortune in 1748, he wanted to sell his printing press to focus on scientific pursuits. It was then that he began his most prolific work, especially in the field of electrical phenomena, where he saw potential domestic uses. He even proposed terms that are now common, such as battery, conductor, charge, negative pole, and positive pole. And he also began a more risky investigation into phenomena that are now known as tornadoes. However, during that time, tensions between settlers and Native Americans grew more frequent. And this forced him to get involved in several commissions to negotiate the end of rebellions and skirmishes. Perhaps this is what motivated him to have a more incisive role in the Colonial Assembly, of which he became a full member in 1751 after closing his long stage as secretary. In 1751, he also helped establish the Pennsylvania Hospital, one of the first in the colonies. And by that time, likewise, the ideas of independence were already beginning to gain strength in the leading circles. Now, in Benjamin's ascending trajectory, his most famous milestone would come in 1752 for scientific reasons. That year, he managed to create a flexible urinary catheter after closely witnessing the kidney stone problems one of his brothers had suffered. And on the other hand, it was also when he carried out his most famous experiment, the kite one. He was in France for a brief period. He wanted to use stormy weather to comprehend the relationship between clouds, lightning, and the resulting fire. He launched a silk kite into the sky with a metal wire, under the hypothesis later proven that the clouds had an electrical charge and that this would be attracted to the kite thanks to the metal. This experiment led him to invent the lightning rod in 1753, when he deduced that an iron rod placed at a high point would attract the electrical charge of a storm to then diffuse it into the ground harmlessly. Such was his importance that it even earned him a subsequent distinction from the British Royal Society. Now, the year 1753 was marked not only by that invention. That year, the adventures of the time increased his role as a public man when conflicts between Indian tribes and French and British settlers escalated to a war point. It was the so-called Franco-Indian War in the North, which for the 13 colonies meant the unprecedented need to organize and defend themselves. In response to this, the famous Albany Congress was convened in 1754, which an experienced Franklin, almost 50 years old, attended for Pennsylvania. And as a primordial fact, he saw here an opportunity to propose an incipient unity among the colonies, the famous Plan of Union, which later was not successful. Even so, Franklin's service was already transcendent, and this earned him his first tough political experience outside of the colonies, as he was appointed as the agent of Pennsylvania in London for 1757 by decision of the legislature to which he belonged. At that time, the colonies lacked direct representation or ambassadors in the British Parliament. What existed was the figure of agents who attended to special matters. And in this case, Franklin's task was nothing less than to protest against the administration of the Penn family, who were the family that had established the Pennsylvania colony several decades ago. According to Benjamin, the privileges enjoyed by this family and the general operating system of the colony were becoming increasingly unsustainable, not just for settlers, but for lawmakers too. This starts to create a breaking point. Benjamin served as an agent there for 5 years, marking his most intense political period. By then, his scientific achievements had made him famous in several European countries. However, this new decade would focus more on expressions such as writing and music, given his taste for instruments and composition. For example, in 1761, he created the glass harmonica, which consisted of a series of glass bowls joined through a rod operated by foot. It is said that even composers like Mozart and Beethoven used it before it fell out of favor due to its lack of popularity. By 1762, Benjamin returned to Philadelphia, staying only a couple of years. Well, the tax rigidity caused by the Sugar Act of 1764 earned him a new mission to London as an agent of Pennsylvania. However, the situation only became more tense the following year after the approval of the Stamp Act, which required a tax stamp on all printed material in the colonies. Although Franklin sought by all available means to object to this new law, his efforts failed, and his reputation was greatly questioned in the colonies. When it was discovered that he had recommended a friend of his to distribute these stamps in Pennsylvania, But Franklin, energetic and tireless at 60 years old, worked to repeal that legislation. In the following months, tension was growing for multiple reasons between the colonies and the British metropolis. Parliament was already aware of the colonies' increasingly difficult situation. Moreover, the law's impact on Britain's trade was affecting numerous interests. This resulted in its repeal being discussed the following year, and that's when Franklin testified before the House of Commons in what is described as a masterful defense of the interests and rights of Americans against the British Parliament. The law was finally repealed that year of 1766, and with it tensions were reduced, although they would soon resurface. But Franklin, at least for now, had the stamp of a famous spokesperson for the colonies. And this led him to also be appointed as an agent for Georgia, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. So he stays in London for a few more years. During this time, interestingly, he rediscovered his preference for chess, a game he had played decades earlier, because he believed it strengthened the qualities of the mind. However, the pressures in the metropolis grew increasingly greater, and after the death of his wife in 1774, Franklin was forced to leave London in 1775. All this amidst the news coming from America, where friction had led to irreconcilable disagreements and where the free spirit had germinated in many settlers who now rejected the relationship with the monarchy. When Franklin returned, he had noticeably aged. His image was the most characteristic one seen in official portraits, a man with long gray hair, a more widened belly, and his picturesque glasses on the tip of his nose. The quiet colonies he had left behind were now mobilized and effervescent. Franklin quickly understood that the only possible course of action was the fight for independence and immediately joined the movement. After arriving in Philadelphia, he was named a Pennsylvania delegate to the Second Continental Congress, where representatives from the 13 colonies ratified the fight against King George III and ordered the creation of an army. Thanks to his postal service experience, he remained the postmaster of the 13 colonies, but now with the focus on freeing themselves from British authority. The following year, he was also one of the actors who most promoted the emancipation process from within Congress. And then he joined the commission to draft the Declaration of Independence, along with deputies like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Thus, after a deep discussion in Congress, the document was finally signed on the 4th of July, 1776, and the colonies were now conceived as free and independent states. Each colony then had to assume its own legislature, and Franklin immediately joined the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention, assuming nothing less than the presidency of it. But within a few months, the same Continental Congress assigned him a new task on the other side of the Atlantic. It was an unparalleled mission, a diplomatic mission in France, with the task of negotiating trade treaties and a military alliance with that country. He had to convince none other than King Louis XVI and Franklin. He achieved it in a span of 2 years, causing France to even openly involve itself in the war as an ally of the American cause. While in France, he learned to interact with the king's court and the waning French aristocracy. He was known for his inventions and his writings, but here he would stand out in another facet, that of a celebrity and fashion icon, as his plump image was even used in commercial products like tobacco boxes. And the style of his clothes and his fur hats were quickly emulated by the French courtiers. In addition, during these years, he also left the world one last invention, bifocal glasses, which combined 2 pairs of glasses into one frame. All this while the war continued on American soil. The Continental Army eventually achieved more decisive victories, until Franklin receives a new and great task in 1783 to negotiate the peace treaty with Great Britain after the victory of the Americans. Was this the famous Treaty of Paris, carved out alongside John Adams and John Jay, which ended the war and recognized the independence of the 13 new states? And so, after another couple of years, Franklin ended up returning to the United States after completing his duties as ambassador. After returning to Philadelphia, the 80-year-old Franklin remained involved in public affairs, and in 1785 he was elected president of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, a position similar to what would be the governor today. In that role, he served as host of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which aimed to produce a Magna Carta for the new nation. He attended this again as a delegate, and it was here where he made his last great public contribution, by establishing identical representation of the states for the Senate and proportional representation for the House of Representatives. Once ready, the Constitution came into effect for 1789, and with this, Franklin became the only founding father who signed the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution and the Treaty of Paris, 3 primal documents of the United States. Franklin, weary, old, and tired, finished the autobiography he had been writing for years. Part of his longevity was due to his knowledge on health-related topics. For example, he always practiced taking long walks, and he had the extravagant habit of taking air baths, which consisted of sitting naked in front of wide-open windows. But one last responsibility still awaited him, presiding over the Society for the Promotion of the Abolition of Slavery in Pennsylvania. However, he could no longer go on, and after 84 well-lived years, he passed away on April 17, 1790. That was the life of Benjamin Franklin, a man ahead of his time with a creative genius that allowed him to find practical solutions to various ills of the time. Multifaceted. Simple, despite his great intellect, always with a strong vocation for serving others. Despite lacking formal education, he showed that his insatiable curiosity could guide him to develop diverse interests. But his greatest creation, his greatest legacy, was none other than the first Republican and federal state in the world, the United States of America. In summary, he is the most charismatic and complete founding father, the apprentice of all trades, and the most famous American of his time. We hope you enjoyed this video. Ronaldo Carrillo spoke to you. We invite you to subscribe to this channel, follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia, and of course share this video, like it, and leave your comments. Until next time, and may God bless you.